Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving deep, really deep, into the Indian Revolt of 1857.
1857.
A turning point, wouldn't you say, for India, for the British Empire, for really the whole world.
Absolutely. A pivotal year. And, to truly grasp it, we have to
The
understand
context,
exactly. The years leading up to 1857, they weren't exactly peaceful.
like a powder keg ready to blow.
Yeah, and our textbook, it really highlights that. All these little uprisings, pockets of resistance.
Showing us that it wasn't just this sudden explosion in 57.
Oh,
The cracks were already there.
precisely. And that's key. Recognizing those tensions helps us understand why 1857 became such a watershed.
So what were some of those simmering tensions? The textbook points to the economy, the way the British were squeezing India dry.
It's stark, the picture they paint. Peasants losing their land, artisans seeing their livelihoods disappear.
And the traders, hampered by those tariffs favoring British goods.
The chapter even quotes Karl Marx from 1853. He talks about how England flooded India with its own textiles, devastating local industries.
It's powerful stuff. And it wasn't just about economic competition, right? It was about control, about power.
Absolutely. One nation asserting dominance over another. And it created this breeding ground for discontent, this widespread poverty.
Which leads us to the political arena. The British were busy playing power games too, with policies like that doctrine of lapse.
Opportunism at its finest, that doctrine, basically allowed them to annex kingdoms if a ruler died without a male heir.
So chipping away at those existing power structures. And they specifically mentioned the annexation of Awadh as a major turning point.
It was. Especially because Awadh was home to so many sepoys, those Indian soldiers in the British Army. Imagine having your homeland taken from you by the very people you serve.
The betrayal, almost.
It alienated those sepoys deeply. And they weren't just soldiers, remember? They were men embedded in their communities with families, traditions,
And beliefs.
beliefs, exactly. And British actions, they often came across as insensitive, culturally.
Yeah, the textbook highlights that. Missionaries, laws seen as interfering with Hindu and Muslim customs.
All adding to this sense of unease.
And for the sepoys, deeply religious men, it felt like an attack on their way of life.
It makes you wonder, how could the British, who prided themselves on their administration, be so blind to the cultural sensitivities?
And then, of course, there's the incident that often overshadows everything else. The greased cartridges,
Ah, yes, the spark.
those new Enfield rifles. Cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat.
Cow and pig fat, specifically.
A nightmare for both Hindu and Muslim sepoys.
The outrage, the sense of defilement, it's almost unbelievable that the British didn't anticipate it.
The textbook says they did little to address the sepoys' concerns, despite their pleas.
A failure of leadership, plain and simple.
And while those cartridges weren't the root cause, they were the tipping point.
The chapter uses a great analogy. They supplied the occasion for the simmering discontent to come out in the open.
And come at it did. Meerut, the sepoys revolting, marching to Delhi, declaring the Mughal emperor as their leader.
Transforming a mutiny into a full-blown rebellion.
Tapping into that historical legacy, that symbol of unity against foreign rule.
And it's pivotal. That moment, it changes everything. The British couldn't ignore it anymore.
So we've got this powder keg, economic hardship, political maneuvering, cultural insensitivity, then boom, the greased cartridges ignite it, and Delhi becomes the epicenter.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a faceless mob, was it?
No, not at all. The book really emphasizes the diverse leaders who emerged, each with their own story.
Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, for example.
Ah, the warrior queen. I shall not give away my Jhansi, her famous declaration.
Refusing to bow to the British after they annexed her kingdom.
And then you have Shamal, a villager, rallying 84 villages to rise up.
Showing that it wasn't just the elites involved, ordinary people putting their lives on the line.
His death, the way the British mutilated his body, it highlights the brutality of this conflict.
Inspiring and heartbreaking all at once.
A reminder that history is about human stories, courage, sacrifices.
But despite the passion, the widespread participation, the revolt ultimately failed.
Lack of unity, limited resources compared to the British.
And support from certain segments of Indian society just wasn't there.
There was anger, yes, but not a unified vision for a post-British India. Different groups, different aspirations.
So more about pushing back against the British than pulling towards a common goal.
Exactly. And that lack of cohesion, that lack of a roadmap, it would ultimately hinder their chances.
So 1857. Years of simmering discontent, ignited by a seemingly minor incident, but fueled by those deep-seated grievances. a moment of defiance, a challenge to British power, but one that ended in defeat. But even in defeat, it would have profound and lasting consequences, wouldn't it? Reshaping the relationship between Britain and India after.
Absolutely. The aftershocks of 1857, they were felt for generations.
Uh,
It's fascinating how differently the British and the Indians viewed this whole thing.
How so?
Well, the British, they saw it as a mutiny, a localized little act of defiance.
But for the Indians,
Some Indian historians, they see it as a war of independence.
a struggle for liberation.
Exactly. And that difference, it's crucial. It shapes how we understand the aftermath, the relationship between Britain and India.
Because the British, they were shaken. They barely held on, and they were determined to prevent another uprising.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest changes, they got rid of the East India Company.
Wow, the end of an era.
It was. They deemed it too weak, inefficient to handle India.
So no more company rule,
Nope. Direct rule under the British Crown. A major shift.
centralizing power, taking control.
Exactly. And the army, they reorganized that too.
Big time, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Deep distrust of the sepoys after the rebellion, so they implemented all these measures.
Like what?
They reduced the number of Indian soldiers, increased the proportion of European troops. A clear signal, right?
Like they were saying, we don't trust you anymore.
Yeah, and it wasn't just numbers. They disbanded most Indian artillery units, too.
Artillery. So limiting their firepower.
Exactly. Control. It was all about control. And then there's that infamous strategy, divide and rule.
Oh, yes. Pitting them against each other.
Separate units based on caste, community, region, sowing discord, hoping to keep them fragmented.
Cynical, but effective.
In the short term, sure, but in the long run, it backfired.
How so?
By emphasizing those divisions, they actually created a sense of shared identity. We're all Indians facing this common oppressor.
Unintended consequences.
The British inadvertently laid the groundwork for Indian nationalism.
But the impact goes beyond just the political and military, right? The textbook talks about the social and economic fallout as well.
Deep scars left on the social fabric of India. The racial hatred, the suspicion, it all intensified.
Just awful to think about how the revolt poisoned that relationship.
British newspapers, they started depicting Indians as subhuman.
Dehumanizing rhetoric used to justify those harsh policies.
A tactic still used today, sadly.
It is. And the economic consequences.
Devastating. The British ramped up their exploitation, extracting resources and wealth.
Because on top of everything else, they're being economically drained.
A system designed to benefit Britain at India's expense.
But even in all this darkness, was there any hope?
There was. The revolt, even though it failed, it awakened a spirit of resistance.
The textbook talks about a new generation of Indian intellectuals, activists.
Inspired by those who fought, they started dreaming of a different future.
A future free from British rule.
Exactly. They saw that unity was key, forging that shared identity.
So the seeds of nationalism were sown.
In the fertile ground of resistance, watered by the blood and sacrifice of 1857.
It's powerful stuff. But, the chapter does a good job of laying things out, but it also leaves us with some questions.
Oh, like what?
Like, what about the ordinary Indians? How did they experience all this?
Their hopes, their fears, their motivations.
The grand narratives often miss those individual stories.
The farmer who had to choose a side, the merchant whose business was destroyed, the mother worrying about her children.
Their voices are important too.
Absolutely. And another thing, how did the British justify all this?
After the revolt,
What stories did they tell themselves to legitimize their continued rule?
because narratives, they're powerful tools.
They are. And the British, they were masters at using them. The rebels are savages. The revolt was barbarity. We're just restoring order.
History written by the victors.
It's a reminder to always question those narratives, to look deeper.
And to confront those uncomfortable truths about power, oppression, colonialism.
The legacies that shape our world today.
1857 was a turning point. It exposed those fault lines in British rule, ignited that fire for freedom.
We've seen how it reshaped everything, politics, society, the economy, but it also planted the seeds for Indian nationalism.
And ultimately for independence.
The road was long, arduous, but it started there.
But that's not the end of the story, is it? The consequences of 1857, they're still being felt.
Oh, absolutely. The ripples, they spread far and wide.
Yeah, those ripples, those consequences, they're still with us today in many ways.
And the British, they knew it. The chapter really dives into their obsession with preventing another 1857.
Well, yeah, it makes sense, right? Their authority, their whole system was challenged, had to be a wake-up call.
Absolutely. And they realized their reliance on Indian sepoys. Well, that had some serious vulnerability.
So they went for a complete overhaul of the army.
Yeah, a major one.
Walk me through it. What were some of those key changes? The book mentions this army amalgamation scheme in 1861.
Right, so the amalgamation scheme, it was all about consolidation, merging the East India Company's forces with the British Crown's army.
Streamlining, centralizing,
Exactly, bringing it all under one roof, under direct British control.
and fewer Indian soldiers overall.
Oh, yeah. They significantly reduced the number of Indian troops while increasing European ones at the same time. Pretty clear message,
We don't trust you.
basically. And they didn't stop there. Almost all Indian artillery units disbanded.
Wow. Artillery, that's serious firepower.
Exactly. Keeping that under European control, it was essential for them.
Shows how deeply the British mindset had shifted. It wasn't just military strategy anymore, it was about asserting dominance.
The control, yeah.
Yeah.
Making it crystal clear who was in charge. And then, of course, there's the divide and rule tactic. Ah, the classic. Pitting different groups against each other.
Yep. Creating units based on caste, religion, region, anything to sow discord and keep them fragmented.
So cynical. But did it work?
Short term, yeah. But long term, not so much.
It's like they created the very thing they were trying to prevent.
Right. By emphasizing those differences, they inadvertently fostered a sense of shared Indian identity.
The common enemy.
Exactly. And that would eventually come back to bite them.
But the impact of the revolt wasn't limited to the military, was it?
No, not at all. Socially, things took a pretty dark turn.
The textbook talks about this intensification of racial prejudice, discrimination.
The revolt really exacerbated those existing tensions.
It's heartbreaking to think about how Indians were treated, second-class citizens in their own country.
And it wasn't just a feeling, it was codified in laws, policies, everything from education to employment.
Designed to keep them down.
Exactly,
Yeah.
to maintain that British supremacy. And the rhetoric in newspapers and journals, it got really ugly.
Dehumanizing, I bet. Oh, yeah. Savages, uncivilized, incapable of self-rule. All those tropes.
Justifying their actions.
Right, painting themselves as the bringers of order and civilization. It's a tactic that's sadly still used today, isn't it?
It is. So we've got political control, military restructuring, social discrimination. And they didn't let up on the economic exploitation either, did they?
Nope. If anything, it intensified. Extracting resources, enriching themselves at India's expense.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
It was a dark period, no doubt. But even amidst all that, there were these flickers of hope. The seeds of change had been planted.
The chapter talks about how the revolt, even though it failed, it really galvanized Indian nationalism.
It showed them that resistance was possible.
A new generation, inspired by those who fought in 1857.
They started to envision a different future, one where India was free.
So the revolt, it was a catalyst in a way.
It was a turning point, a moment that would echo through history.
It's incredible to think about how one event can have such a ripple effect.
It really is, and we're still grappling with those ripples today in many ways.
So 1857, it was a clash of cultures, a fight for freedom, a brutal conflict with lasting consequences. We've explored those simmering tensions that led to the uprising, the key figures and events that shaped its course, the reasons it ultimately failed, and those far-reaching consequences. It's been a deep dive into a pivotal chapter in history.
And a reminder that history is never simple. It's full of different perspectives, interpretations.
And that understanding those different viewpoints is crucial if we want to truly learn from the past.
Absolutely. And hopefully avoid repeating our same mistakes.
The 1857 revolt, it might have been crushed, but it ignited a fire for freedom that would eventually burn bright. It's a story of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit to challenge injustice.
To strive for a better future.
A future where all people are treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the Indian Revolt of 1857. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.